We all set? Our guest tonight is Neil Chatelain. Mr. Chatelain is the author of Defending the Arteries of the Rebellion, Confederate Naval Operations in the Mississippi River Valley, 1861 to 1865. His presentation tonight will be on that subject. Please limit your entries in the chat box to questions related to the subject. Just a reminder to keep your microphone muted during the program so that we can all enjoy the program without background noise. Thank you for joining us. Tonight's guest again is Neil P. Chatelain, discussing his book, Defending the Arteries of Rebellion, Confederate Naval Operations in the Mississippi River Valley, 1861 to 1865, just released by Savas Beatty in September 2020. This series is brought to you by CivilWarTalk.com, the American Civil War discussion forum. We're pleased to be able to bring these fantastic Civil War authors and programs to you via the live virtual platform. If you aren't already a member of Civil War Talk, we'll be providing that membership information later in the program. I hope you'll all join the Civil War Talk community.
Our guest tonight is Neil P. Chatelain, an adjunct professor of history at Lone Star College, North Harris, and a social studies instructor at Carl Wunsch Senior High School in Spring, Texas. The former U.S. Navy surface warfare officer is a graduate of the University of New Orleans, the University of Houston, and the University of Louisiana Monroe. Neil researches U.S. naval history with a focus on Confederate naval operations. He is the author of Fought Like Devils, the Confederate Gunboat McRae, 2014, and many magazine, journal, and online articles. He lives with his wife, Brittany, in Humble, Texas. Tonight, Mr. Chatelain will be discussing his latest book, Defending the Arteries of the Rebellion, Confederate Naval Operations in the Mississippi River Valley, 1861 to 1865, just released by Savas Beatty last month. Most studies of the Mississippi River focus on Union campaigns to open and control it, while overlooking Southern attempts to stop them. Chatelain's Defending the Arteries of Rebellion, Confederate Naval Operations in the Mississippi River Valley, 1861 to 1865, is the other side of the story, the first modern, full-length treatment of inland naval operations from the Confederate perspective. Chatelain grounds his study in extensive archival and firsthand accounts, official records, and a keen understanding of terrain and geography. The result is a fast-paced, well-crafted, and endlessly fascinating account that is sure to please the most discriminating student of the Civil War. Please join me in welcoming Neil Chatelain.
All right, hello everybody. Welcome. I'm glad you guys could all make it out today. I'm gonna share my screen now and we'll go ahead and get started here. So thanks for having me on. First of all, it's fantastic to be here and I look forward to getting some information out there and answering some questions, and we'll kind of go from there. So we'll start with why I chose to write this book, and there's four kind of main areas of why this topic was interesting to me and why I wanted to present it in this format. So the first is to prevent an alternative to the US-centric focus of river operations. So most people talk about the Mississippi River during the Civil War. They talk Ulysses Grant, Vicksburg, maybe some Port Hudson if you know a little bit more, and then David Dixon Porter supporting Grant. And, but there's this entire other perspective of what the Confederacy did to maintain control of the Mississippi River Valley overall. And you'll hear me say Mississippi River Valley a lot and not just Mississippi River, because I wanted to expand that look beyond just the Mississippi River itself. And we'll look at what that kind of looks like later on in a little bit. And then I wanted to highlight a lot of innovations the Confederacy introduced in the Mississippi River Valley and how those affected the course, the conduct of the war. And then kind of as an add-on bonus is I wanted to dispel a little bit of the lost cause ideology by pointing at some circumstances of how the Confederacy operated these ships and then how effective they were and what their overall plans were and how it was a much grander design than what people initially think. So that's kind of my why look at this situation. So we'll kind of just dive right in there. So the Mississippi River is what we mostly look at when we think of the Civil War in the Western waters and all of these kind of ideas. You know, there's Grant with Port Hudson, with Vicksburg, and Banks with Port Hudson, and David Dixon Porter. And then there's a couple of ships, but they always kind of get destroyed by the US Navy and there's not much of a fight. And then the story usually ends with, and then Vicksburg gets captured. But it's but there's a much bigger concept there of the Mississippi River Valley here. So these are all tributaries, distributaries, bayous, rivers, lakes, and inland waters that connect with the Mississippi River. So it's not just a, here's the Mississippi River, and let's look at that. There's a much deeper combat system going on here because, you know, the war doesn't end with just the Mississippi River. All of these waterways feed into or out of that same water, that same river. And so it's a much larger, more complex system. And it's worth just noting that so that we can see how that affected the course of the war, and how, even though the United States gained control of the river in 1863, that didn't mean that they controlled the inland waterways beyond that river as well. So we'll look at that a little bit as well tonight. First, though, we need to look at what the Confederacy wanted to do, because another big takeaway is that the Confederacy didn't really try to defend the Mississippi River. And if you look at the statistics, it's kind of the opposite there. And I wanted to highlight some overall capabilities and designs and plans. So first off, at the beginning of the Civil War, you know, there were numerous shipyards for the Confederacy, not as many as the United States, of course, but of those shipyards, the vast majority were on the Mississippi River itself. In New Orleans and in Upper Louisiana, in the Tennessee area as well. And you can see that the Mississippi River and its shipyards at the beginning of the war outnumber all of the other shipyards in the Confederacy at the time. And so what we see is that the Confederacy has a major shipbuilding infrastructure and ship support system on the Mississippi River, and that they're going to use that to make it the focal point of their defense at the beginning of the Civil War. And so the biggest part of that is going to be ironclad construction, because the Confederacy wanted to use ironclads to defend its inland waterways and to defend its coastline as much as it could, to try and augment its limited resources and numbers to overcome the might that was the United States Navy. And so what we're going to see is that the Confederacy is going to develop ironclad construction programs. And when you see where these ironclad construction programs are in the first part of the war, it becomes pretty obvious that the Confederacy's major goal is to defend the Mississippi River Valley. So let's just look at some of these numbers and statistics here. From September to December 1861, the Confederacy started 7 ironclad construction programs. 6 of those 7 were on the Mississippi River. If we extend that from September 1861 to March 1862, the Confederacy had 13 ironclad construction programs, 9 of which were on the Mississippi River. So it's a pretty obvious takeaway that the Confederacy is trying to defend the Mississippi River more than any other part of its coastline, and it's devoting more resources to the construction of ships on that defense, more so than what most people generally see. And of course, most people generally don't see it because not all of these ships were completed and made it into active service. And we'll look at some numbers and statistics on that in a little bit as well. And also because if you look at it, Virginia has 2 ironclads on that chart, and one of those is the famous Confederate ironclad Virginia that gets all the headlines. So the headlines aren't on the Mississippi River as much, even though the Confederacy is devoting more time and energy and resources to defend that with more ships. And it's also one thing to consider in that on the Mississippi River, the Confederacy is expanding its naval capability, not just with shipyards and not just with construction programs, but also with support systems. And I'll just take New Orleans as an example. So in New Orleans itself, there was a Marine hospital that was constructed on the captured Union ship, the Star of the West, that was renamed the Confederate state ship St. Phillip. They developed a naval laboratory on shore in New Orleans that made, shells, gunpowder, ordnance, friction primers, so on and so forth. There was a shoe factory in New Orleans making 250 pairs of boots a day. Several powder works making upwards of 5,000 pounds of gunpowder a day, plus at least 4 different iron works making guns, gun carriages, so on and so forth. So, New Orleans is this major focal point of the early programs of Confederate naval defense, and we're going to see it continue to try and develop into that. But the takeaway here is that the Confederacy had shipyards and capabilities on the Mississippi River, and they used those to try and expand their operations by expanding mostly in the Mississippi River in the first year of the war. Now, one thing to mention, however, is that they're not doing this alone, and that the activity is mainly being done augmented by the use of enslaved labor. And so it's something that's worth mentioning and worth considering, is that the Confederacy is going to use the labor of enslaved persons throughout the course of the war to maintain this river defense that they're trying to construct. And so what we're going to see is that individual slaves that are skilled craftsmen are going to be hired out to shipyards. We're going to see that happen in places like New Orleans and in places like Alexandria, Louisiana, pretty regularly. We're going to see larger numbers of slaves augmenting entire ships and crews, especially in the New Orleans area, where they'll just take on hundreds of slaves at a time to work as like night crews or other crews to augment the normal shipyard complements there. We're going to see the infrastructure of plantations supporting shipbuilding construction efforts, especially on the Yazoo River, where they literally take all the small steam engine and all the small infrastructure and just for hundreds of miles, bring them to one spot, converge it all, and then use that to try to augment their limited shipbuilding capacity. And then slaves are also going to support by constructing land fortifications, river obstructions, and so on. And we'll have teams of at least 1,000 slaves in some places, such as on the Yazoo River, on Bayou Teche in southern Louisiana, on the Red River in Louisiana as well. And most surprising to me is augmenting naval crews. There were slaves that literally were brought onto the Confederate ships to serve as the coal heavers and to help operate ships when they were operating behind the front lines. So ships that were in areas not being threatened in that immediate time, they would offload the white crew members, transfer them to another ship a state over, and then use enslaved persons to kind of augment the limited crew to maintain that ship's readiness and maintenance so that it could respond later on. And so what we're going to see is that slaves are going to play a large role in the defense of this Mississippi River Valley. And I just thought it would be worth mentioning that individually in its own slide, because generally that's just not something mentioned very often. So let's look at the origins, the start of these campaigns. So the first year of the war is mostly focused on ship construction, ship conversion, building a naval force, but there are still campaigns and battles that happened in 1861, and I'll highlight them on this map here for you. So the first real naval activity is privateering operations coming out of New Orleans. The first Confederate privateers came out of New Orleans. The first letters of marque were issued to ships in New Orleans, and they're going to capture a few Union merchants in the early part of the war before the Union blockade gets established solidly on the Mississippi River's mouth itself. Besides that, we have Confederate Navy, Army, and Marine joint operations that seize control of Ship Island off the coast of Mississippi, which they will later abandon, and then the United States Navy will seize it and use that as their base of operations to launch attacks against both New Orleans and Mobile later in the war. There are Confederate ships supporting Leonidas Polk when he enters Kentucky in September 1861. At least one Confederate warship, a couple of Army transports were there supporting those operations, helping to seize Hickman, Kentucky and Columbus, Kentucky, and helping to maintain those positions until the fortifications around Columbus were constructed that turned it into the quote unquote Gibraltar of the West in the first year of the war. In October 1861, the Confederates made a sortie to try and break the Union blockade at the battle at the head of the passes at the very mouth of the river. And they won a tactical victory, drove the United States out of the river, but it didn't break the Union blockade. It's similar to the January 1863 Confederate Navy sortie from Charleston Harbor, where they pushed ships out, the Union ships retreated, but they couldn't capitalize on it and declare an official break of the blockade. Army transports were there at the Battle of Belmont, transporting Confederate soldiers from Columbus across the river to reinforce the Confederates that fled at Belmont when Ulysses Grant launched his initial attack. And so Confederate ships are there in a support role for sure. And then there's a 6-month stretch from mid to late 1861 to the spring of 1862, where the Confederacy has Army and Navy ships operating in conjunction together, and they're basically fighting a campaign for control of the coastline of Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama. And over time, they eventually get buttoned up in Mobile Bay and in the area near Lake Pontchartrain, and the United States Navy expands its control of this coastal area. But like I said, these are just small campaigns and battles, and the major focus on both the United States and the Confederacy is ship construction in 1861. And we'll look at what that ship construction looks like specifically here and what challenges that brought to the Confederacy particularly. The biggest challenge is organization. These are all organizations that operated ships for the Confederacy on the Mississippi River, particularly in 1861 and in 1862. Okay, so we have the Confederacy's regular Navy augmented by the Marine Corps. They're going to operate ironclad warships, wooden warships, and so on. The Confederacy also has its own revenue service, which is a copycat of the United States Revenue Marine, which is the precursor to the U.S. Coast Guard. And so we're going to see revenue cutters operating in New Orleans as well. The Confederate Army has gunboats operating at the top of the river and at the river's mouth and in the coastal areas of Louisiana as well. And they don't always listen to Confederate naval authorities, and vice versa. And to make it even more confusing, the Confederate River Defense Fleet is a part of the Confederate Army, but it's manned by civilian contractors, not Confederate soldiers. And those contractors basically do whatever they want sometimes. Sometimes they cooperate, sometimes they completely refuse to, and that just creates confusion in some places. There's Confederate privateers that sometimes get augmented into the Confederate Navy, sometimes they don't, and they do their own thing, because remember, privateers are out to make money, of course. Louisiana made its own Navy as well, and it was just a couple of ships strong, and they were improvised, but we have a whole nother chain of command with this Confederate Navy augmented by this Louisiana Navy. Add on top of that, government contracted civilian ships. These are tugs that are civilians operated, but they're under contract to either the Army or the Navy or another group, and who controls them, who has the contract, and what supplies they're moving and supporting becomes a major issue over time, because the organizations will, of course, begin fighting one another for resources. And then on top of all of that, you've got blockade runners trying to sneak in and out of the river or the coastal areas. And so we have a very split chain of command on the Mississippi River for the Confederacy, particularly. Now, even with just the Confederate Navy, the chain of command was still split. The guy in charge of the Confederate Navy's Mississippi River Squadron is the first man in the photo there, Captain George Collins, and even he has a split command. So he's in charge of the entire Mississippi River Valley, as well as all of coastal Gulf of Mexico from the edge of Mobile Bay as far west as the coast of Texas. So he's got a very vast coastline, as well as the entire length of the Mississippi River to oversee. And so he's going to split his command, and there's going to be subordinate commanders. Farther upriver, Commander Robert Pinckney is going to be in charge in the Tennessee, Kentucky area when Hollins isn't there. And in the New Orleans area, Commander John Mitchell is going to be in charge when Hollins is further upriver. And in coastal Louisiana, another guy is in charge of these subordinate commands. And then to make it even more complex, the New Orleans Naval Shipyard, the Memphis Naval Shipyards, these are under the command of different officers that don't answer to Hollins or to anyone else. They're their own independent commands that answer to Stephen Mallory, the Secretary of the Navy for the Confederacy. And that's going to create even more confusion because the shipyard commander is in charge of building ships and supplying them, but not operating them. And sometimes he'll issue operational orders, and in other cases, Army commanders are going to go to him because he's the most senior officer in the area. And they're going to say, can you move this ship? And he's going to go, I actually have no control over the movement of that ship, to tell you that honestly. So it's a very, very split force here. And to make it even more complex, there were grudges amongst the commanders of all these different groups. So, Montgomery, the commander of the River Defense Fleet, swore to cooperate with the Confederacy, but John Stevenson, his subordinate commander, his second in command, swore to never cooperate with the Confederate Navy ever, and basically would do his own thing when he was left in charge of his ship. So this organizational confusion is going to become a major factor as these groups compete for supplies, resources, manpower, and everything else. So just one quick example of that, the River Defense Fleet paid their sailors more money. And so sailors in the Confederate Navy would desert and then enlist in the River Defense Fleet as a civilian contractor to make more money. And so some ships were being, struck with manpower issues while others were oversupplied with manpower because they thought they could make a quick buck and move on from there. Now, let's look at the hard numbers of ships involved here, because most people are thinking like, oh, there's just a few ships involved with this Confederate naval defense. And it's actually quite the opposite. The bar graph is a lot here, so let's just focus on one part, the far left. The Confederacy planned to operate in the spring 1862 campaigns that they knew were coming. They planned to operate 9 ironclad ships, 45 wooden ships, and 5 floating batteries or sailing vessels. Now, they don't complete all of those, but that's their plan, is to operate all these. But remember, they're split between all these different groups. Now, let's compare that to the U.S. Navy and what it's got in the 1862 River Campaign. The Western Gulf Blockading Squadron, that's David Farragut, the guys who captured New Orleans, they have 25 wooden warships and 29 mortar vessels. Those are just ships or barges carrying a giant mortar on it and maybe like a cannon for some defense. The Western Gunboat Flotilla, that's Foote and then Charles Davis later on after Foote gets wounded in the foot, by the way. And they have 10 ironclads. Those are the city-class ironclads, the Pook Turtles that get built that everybody knows, like the USS Cairo and so on. And then they have 4 wooden ships as well. Those are the Timber-class, the Lexington and the Tyler that help at the Battle of Shiloh. And then they have 11 mortar vessels as well. And then the U.S. also has the U.S. Ram Fleet, which is an Army-operated group. That's the Union copy of the River Defense Fleet, which operates upriver with the Western Gunboat Flotilla in conjunction. Now, looking at it on paper, we have the United States with 25, 35, 40, about 50 ironclads and wooden warships. I'm not going to count the mortar vessels because in my personal opinion, like they didn't really do very much. And a mortar vessel is about the equivalent of a gun on a Confederate fortification on land. So those kind of offset each other. And so the United States Navy is going to bring about 50 mobile wooden warships or ironclad warships to this fight in the 1862 River Campaign. The Confederate Navy is going to bring, on paper, their plan is to bring about 60 warships, ironclads, and wooden vessels. The Confederates plan on having 9 ironclads to counteract the Union Navy's 10, and they plan on having about 50 wooden vessels to counteract the U.S. Navy's about 40. And so on paper, at the end of 1861 and the beginning of 1862, the two sides are kind of at this parity of equal. And so, the United States Navy has a real challenge here. Now, yeah, it's true that the U.S. Navy has purpose-built warships, like the Western Gulf Blockading Squadron has these larger warships with dozens of cannons on them. But, and the U.S. and the Confederate Navy has largely improvised warships. But, ship for ship, pound for pound, like it's a roughly even fight on paper is the plan. Now, when the campaign begins in 1862, the Confederacy is not ready because their ships are not fully completed. And that's where this second bar on the far left comes in. The Confederates only get 3 of those 9 ironclads operational in 1862. The other 6 get destroyed before they're completed. They only get 35 of the 45 wooden ships in service by the time the fighting starts, and only 4 of the 5 floating batteries and sailing vessels. And so that's where the big difference comes in, is that the United States Navy brought 50 warships plus another 40 mortar vessels into actual operation. The Confederacy planned to do something very similar, but their numbers just fell short just because the U.S. Navy had more resources, a clearer chain of command, and were able to build their ships faster. And so the Confederates' plan was very much to gain parity. And on paper, it's got a couple of points in these early months, they had parity, but then they fell behind in the construction efforts. And then of these 40 or so ships, the 3 ironclads, 35 wooden ships, and 4 sailing vessels and floating batteries that the Confederacy does manage to build for this 1862 campaign, they're still split all over the place with different chains of command. The Confederate Navy has 20 of those ships. The River Defense Fleet has 14. The Army has 4. The revenue cutters, there's 2 of those. And then Louisiana has 2 ships in its Navy. And so the chain of command is still very split. And what the Confederacy fails to do is give one section of the river to one organization and another section of the river to another. And so instead, what we're going to see is that upriver, half the River Defense Fleet and some of the ships from the Navy are going to fight there. And then downriver, the revenue cutters and the Louisiana Navy and some Confederate Navy ships and some River Defense Fleet ships will fight there. And it's going to be a hodgepodge of who's actually in charge. Nobody knows. Whereas for the United States, David Farragut is in charge downriver, and Foote, and then later Davis, after Foote gets wounded, is in charge upriver. And the chain of command is very clear cut as to who is running what. And so this chain of command issue is going to basically kick the Confederates and bite them in the butt because they can't really support their own thoughts here. And so the U.S. comes clear with these advantages in that their programs are better equipped, they can build ships faster, their ships are more purpose-built for wartime operations, and they have a better supply system overall, and that clear chain of command. 1862 is what I call like the year of decision with this. It's the year where the U.S. Navy doesn't gain control of the Mississippi River completely, but the writing is on the wall, and we can tell that the Confederacy made its big effort and failed. And so what we see is 3 major campaigns develop in 1862. The Upriver Campaign starts with the battles at Fort Henry and Donelson, where U.S. Navy forces and Ulysses Grant's forces seize that. And I only mention this because that capture, not only does it force the evacuation of Nashville for the Confederacy, but it also forces the evacuation of Columbus, Kentucky, which is the Confederates' first defense on the Mississippi River. The Confederates retreat from there to Island Number 10, and the Confederate Army and naval forces support Island Number 10 pretty effectively. They're transporting supplies. There are cases where the Confederate Navy and their gunboats stop Union attacks. They evacuate soldiers from one section of the defenses to another. So they provide a pretty adequate defense in support of Island Number 10, but it's not enough. And after the Union ironclads get operational and no Confederate ironclads meet them there, then the island basically gets cut off and is forced to surrender. Then there's further fighting in May, just a month later, at the Fort Pillow area north of Memphis, where the Confederate River Defense Fleet launches a counterattack at the Battle of Plum Point Bend, where Confederate wooden ships ram and sink 2 Union ironclads. So it is capable to destroy these ironclad ships. And we're going to see many of them get destroyed over the course of the war with this fighting. So the Confederates win a tactical victory, but they can't capitalize on it. And in fact, the 2 Union ironclads that get sunk are going to get refloated and put back in service later in the war. So it's kind of a victory, but it's also kind of not. And then after the U.S. Army under Ulysses Grant and Henry Halleck and Rosecrans and everybody else and Pope captures Corinth, Mississippi, then Memphis is outflanked and is evacuated. And that causes the Confederate River Defense Fleet to fight one kind of last stand near Memphis, and it's basically destroyed there. And so what we see is this continuous campaign of fighting in February, March, April, May, June. This is nonstop continuous service going on. It isn't a battle and then nothing happens for 2 months or 3 months or 4 months like what happens in land campaigns sometimes. Further downriver, it's David Farragut and his attempt to seize New Orleans that he ultimately proved successful in. And then Farragut begins moving upriver and Admiral Davis begins moving downriver, and the 2 plan to meet in the middle at Vicksburg. And that's where the Confederates kind of launched their counterattack. So part of that is Union naval forces go up the White River to support Union efforts to move south from Missouri into Arkansas. Again, another Union ironclad is severely damaged there, but it is not sunk. And Confederate naval forces fighting on land are doing the fighting there. And then we have the campaign in the summer for Vicksburg, where it's largely a naval campaign, and it's largely one Confederate ship, the ironclad Arkansas, fighting against the combined forces of Davis and Farragut. And this one Confederate ship is a very haphazard organization. It's got Confederate naval officers, some sailors that are leftovers from these earlier battles, and then it has Army soldiers from the Vicksburg garrison augmenting the crew. And it just fought continuous fights. It fought to get out of the Yazoo River, to get under the guns of Vicksburg. Farragut tried to sink the Arkansas repeatedly. At one point, they were down to like a handful of officers and about 25 soldiers manning this entire ironclad that was supposed to have upwards of 300 crew members on it because everybody had been wounded on the ship. And so it became a very haphazard thing. But that stalled the efforts of the U.S. Navy to capture Vicksburg long enough for the river's water levels to drop with the annual water drops. And that forced Farragut to retreat from Vicksburg so that his ships wouldn't be grounded in the mud, essentially, as the river fell. Then the Confederates launched counterattacks. Everybody always talks about the counterattacks of the Confederates moving upriver or moving north into Maryland with the Battle of Antietam, Robert E. Lee there. And then the Confederates moving into Kentucky with the Heartland campaign, and then the Confederate counterattack at Corinth, Mississippi. The Confederates also counterattacked south to try and recapture southern Louisiana, hopefully to even recapture New Orleans. And they launched an army offensive to attack Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and the Confederate ironclad Arkansas was part of that attack plan. But it ran into some serious mechanical issues and was destroyed by its own crew while being bombarded by Union ships because it ran aground, its engines failed, and it just couldn't keep pace with the Union efforts. And so the Baton Rouge counterattack failed. But then those same sailors helped to establish the Confederate defenses at Port Hudson, which is where the 1862 campaigns end, with the United States Navy controlling almost all of the river except for what's between Port Hudson and Vicksburg. So that's kind of the 1862 campaign. And I just want to highlight that what we're talking about is not just a few ships here. These are a couple of maps of these battles being fought. So on the left, you have the Island Number 10 campaign. And notice that, you know, there's Foote with his Union ironclads bombarding Island Number 10. There are Confederate ships supporting Island Number 10 directly. There are Confederate ships supporting New Madrid, which has its own defenses. There are Confederate ships trying to stop Union outflanking movements further south. And then there are Confederate ships that help to transport supplies, evacuate soldiers from one area to another, bring out the wounded, so on and so forth. So it's a pretty complex campaign, and it's not just the ships were there and then they were defeated sort of an idea. You know, there was a much more complex maneuvering of systems to support the Army land fortifications there. And then I want to bring up New Orleans very briefly, just because the battle at Fort Jackson and St. Philip is the largest naval battle, ship-to-ship engagement of the Civil War. And nobody really talks about it because everyone says, well, Farragut passed the forts and then defeated the quote-unquote Confederate fleet beyond, and then that was it. And, you know, it was a much harder fight than that. Of the ships that Farragut sent upriver, a quarter of them failed to get upriver. You know, 3 were turned back by fire from the forts and the ships. Another one was sunk trying to get upriver. And so it was not a sure thing for Farragut when he did this. And you can see that the Confederate Navy had, or not just the Navy, but the Confederate Navy, the River Defense Fleet, you know, the Louisiana Navy and so on, had a host of ships there to oppose him. The issue was that those ships didn't have a clear chain of command, and they pretty much fought the battle as individual ships, not as a fleet, whereas Farragut issued a specific direction for his entire squadron. Each ship knew what its role was, it knew what its purpose was, and so their commanders were much more informed and can make a much more cohesive plan. And so that's where the organizational challenges failed the Confederacy, with that lack of a clear chain of command. Now, after 1862's disaster for the Confederacy's defense of the Mississippi River, it tried to actually reconstitute its naval forces pretty substantially. And we see official large-scale Confederate naval yards established at Yazoo City, Mississippi, where the ironclad Arkansas was finished, and at Shreveport, Louisiana on the Red River. And we're going to see substantial ironclad construction programs get attempted again to try to renew control of the Mississippi River Valley. On the Yazoo River, they try and build 3 more ironclads. On Bayou Teche, they try to build an ironclad further up near Vermilionville, which is present-day Lafayette, Louisiana. They try to build 2 ironclads on the Tennessee River, but they abandoned those projects because they would take too many supplies. They build an ironclad in Shreveport, Louisiana, and try to build another one, but that fails because they don't have enough supplies for that. And then we see reconstituted flotillas. On the Red River, the ironclad Missouri, and then several wooden ships that escaped from New Orleans form a makeshift naval squadron there. 4 warships form a makeshift naval squadron on the Atchafalaya River. Another partially ironclad vessel, and then 1 wooden ship that they capture from the U.S. Navy defends Bayou Teche until that other ironclad could hopefully be finished. Several wooden steamers, the leftovers of these 1862 campaigns, are all on the Yazoo River. And then on the Arkansas River, there's a couple of warships as well operating there. So the Confederates don't have 0 ships left. They still have a substantial number of wooden ships. They're just outnumbered by the U.S. Navy a lot after 1862, but they're still trying to augment that with construction of another more than half dozen ironclad programs. And we're going to see some of those work and some of those fail pretty miserably. 1863, of course, focuses largely on Vicksburg itself. And there were substantial campaigns, and I don't want to go into too much detail because I'm not a super expert on the land warfare elements of Vicksburg, but I did research a lot of the supporting elements by the Confederate Navy who support the defense of the Vicksburg area. So, for example, there were lots of skirmishes in late 1862 along the Yazoo River. The Confederacy introduced mine warfare with the use of torpedoes there, and that's where the USS Cairo was sunk. Confederate sailors augmented the land defenses at Fort Hinman when the siege of Fort Hinman occurred in January 1863 in Arkansas to get the United States Navy into the Arkansas River. At the Yazoo Pass expedition, what we see is that the Confederacy is going to sink a couple of its warships and transports to serve as river obstructions at Fort Pemberton. And then its supply ships, its transports are going to support the Confederate garrison at Fort Pemberton, which stops the Union advances down that section and causes Grant to rethink his plans there. The Steele's Bayou expedition, Confederate sailors and soldiers together work together. They don't have as many ships in that area, but what they do is they use manpower to try and block the U.S. Navy from getting there, and they create more river obstructions. And then during the actual final siege of Vicksburg, what we see is the U.S. Navy, David Porter himself, is going to go up the Yazoo River, seize Yazoo City. He's going to destroy the 3 Confederate ironclads under construction and conversion in Yazoo City, and he's going to eliminate the threat of the Confederacy there. They lose another Union ironclad in the process of doing that as another one strikes a mine there and sinks. Most Confederate ships are still around after Vicksburg surrenders, though, and they're all supporting Joseph Johnston's attempted relief efforts coming from Jackson, Mississippi. And it's not until Joseph Johnston gets pushed back by Ulysses Grant's forces after Vicksburg falls that these inland waters, the Confederates, destroy the rest of their ships. And in fact, only one ship of about 20 or 25 wooden vessels operated by the Confederacy on these waters falls into Union hands, and that's the small improvised warship St. Mary right there in the picture. So the U.S. does gain control of the Mississippi River, of course, but that's not where the story ends. There's much more to it than that, and it's all the fighting on these tributary and distributary waters. There are fights on the Red River even as Vicksburg is being besieged, and the Confederates managed to defeat several Union forces on the Red River, capture several Union ships, and capture and sink another Union ironclad on this fight. The Confederates try to defend the Bayou Teche area, but the U.S. Navy manages to defeat them, and then Nathaniel Banks pushes the Confederate Army out of that area, and that pre-stages Nathaniel Banks to make his final siege on Port Hudson in conjunction with Ulysses Grant. That happens in the first months of 1863 and results in one partial ironclad for the Confederacy, a wooden ship being lost, and then another ironclad under construction to be destroyed before it's finished. On the Atchafalaya River, another Confederate ship gets defeated and sunk, and then 3 others make their escape after the U.S. Navy defeats them in a battle in early April 1863. The U.S. Navy moves up towards Little Rock in October 1863, and the Confederate Navy destroys its remaining ships on the Arkansas River there, and all those sailors are then going to march south and augment the Confederate Navy in Shreveport, Louisiana, to augment the ironclad program going on in Shreveport with the ironclad Missouri. There's the famous Red River Campaign, where David Porter and Nathaniel Banks try to march up the Red River to seize Shreveport, Louisiana, and are stopped. The Confederate Navy doesn't have the largest role in defeating that. However, they do stand by the entire time. And one reason David Dixon Porter moves so slowly in his efforts to get to Shreveport, it's not just because he's waiting for Nathaniel Banks. It's also because he knows the Confederates have at least one ironclad. They have at least several wooden ram ships that have sunk Union ironclads before. They have mines. They have some sort of torpedo boat expedition getting formed. And so the Confederate Navy is a threat in Porter's mind, which is going to cause him to stall, which then causes the Red River Campaign to peter out and fail overall. I'm not saying it caused the whole campaign to fail, but it was something in the back of Porter's mind the entire time. In early 1864, the Confederates launch a resurgent movement by soldiers in the Yazoo River, and they capture a couple of Union warships and sink them, and then the U.S. Navy has to go re-clean out the entire Yazoo River again of Confederate cavalry trying to capture and destroy Union ships. On the White River, the same thing happens, and the Confederates capture Union warships. These are Confederate cavalry soldiers attacking, disabling, boarding, and seizing Union warships. And then the largest example of that is on the Tennessee River, when Nathan Bedford Forrest's cavalry, in conjunction with John Bell Hood moving towards Nashville, captures several Union warships and supply ships on the Tennessee River, and then attacks and destroys the Johnsonville Supply Depot, which you guys can have the opportunity to learn more about next week, of course, with another talk that goes on next week. I'll do a pitch on at the end here. And then there's even more. At the very end of the war, more Confederate guerrillas and cavalry are destroying Union ships on the water. And so when the Confederacy loses its ships, the Army starts to take over in some places and wages a more unconventional war of using land artillery, field artillery to disable ships, board them, capture them, and either destroy them or use them for their own purposes. And then finally, at the end of the war, the last Confederate ironclad to surrender in the war is the Confederate ironclad Missouri in June 1865. And it surrenders, and that brings about an end to the Confederate Navy power, except for, of course, the wooden raider Shenandoah, making it still voyage around the entire Earth at that point. At that point, it is in the South Pacific Ocean, just across the equator for there, trying to get around to go back to England. So the war ends, but of course, we've still got some more stuff to talk about. First, innovations. These are all innovations that the Confederate naval forces implemented in one form or another, either first or re-implemented first on the Mississippi River Valley, and they were either copied by other Confederate naval forces or they were copied by the U.S. Navy as well. So the Confederacy introduced commerce raiding out of New Orleans. The first commerce raider, the CSS Sumter, operated out of New Orleans. That was its home base when it was first acquired and outfitted. I already mentioned privateering started in New Orleans. The privateer Calhoun, which was the first Confederate privateer to receive its letter of marque and to attack and capture Union merchant ships. It would later join the Confederate Navy and then be captured as a blockade runner and then join the Union Navy and then get destroyed later on as well. So it had a very storied career as well. The Confederacy also implemented joint operations with the Army and the Marine Corps and amphibious operations with that whole Ship Island expedition. It's the first major expedition where it's a joint operation between the Army and the Navy and the Marine Corps for the Confederacy. And it's the first time the Confederacy launches an amphibious operation. It's not an amphibious assault. They're not landing under fire, but they are transporting people over the ocean to a beach, landing and fortifying a position. The first ironclad in North America is the ironclad ram Manassas, which I'll touch on my last slide before we get to the Q&A. And that was, of course, then emulated with other ironclads throughout. The Confederacy first experimented with submarines in the Mississippi River Valley on Lake Pontchartrain, just north of New Orleans. And the people who built that submarine later moved to Mobile, built another submarine, and then made a later move to Charleston, where they built the H.L. Hunley, which is the famous one that sunk the first Union warship to be sunk in battle. The Confederacy implemented a ram fleet operated by the Army, and the U.S. Navy would copy that, or the U.S. Army would copy it, with the United States ram fleet. And then, of course, naval torpedoes, underwater sea mines were introduced by the Confederacy and used with effect first on the Mississippi River Valley and then later on elsewhere as well, particularly in the Mobile area. So I said a lot of different battles, and there was a lot of back and forth that I wanted to touch on. But one thing that is a clear thing to me that I want to make clear for everyone else is that the Confederacy achieved some significant tactical victories throughout the course of this war on the Mississippi River Valley, but it could just never really follow up with strategic results. And so we'll see a whole laundry list of tactical victories that they just can't really follow on with to gain real results. So they've successfully launched an amphibious operation to seize Ship Island off the Mississippi coastline, but then they abandoned it a few months later. They successfully seized Columbus, Kentucky with the support of the Confederate Navy, but of course that drives Kentucky to take a more pro-Union stance. They successfully push out the U.S. Navy at the Battle of the Head of Passes in October 1861, but the U.S. Navy maintains its river blockade, and it doesn't break that blockade. They successfully evacuate Confederate soldiers from New Madrid when it gets cut off, but then those soldiers end up surrendering at Island number 10 anyway. They successfully sink Union ironclads at Plum Point Bend, but it doesn't stop the Union operations, and those sunken ships are refloated and put back into Union service. The Arkansas successfully saves Vicksburg, which is a pretty big strategic result. It keeps Vicksburg in Union hands for about a year. But then when they try to capitalize on it and reconquer southern portions of the Mississippi River, it fails and they can't regain the strategic initiative in the South. The Confederates successfully defend the Bayou Teche area in January 1863, but they lose one of their ships in the process, and then that only saved them for about 2 or 3 months before they end up getting pushed out of that area totally. Early operations on the Red River, several Union ships, including the ironclad Indianola, are captured and destroyed or put into Confederate service, and that keeps the Red River in Confederate hands until the next spring when the U.S. Navy makes its Red River Campaign in 1864. So that's a pretty good strategic result. So we've got a good win there at least. The Confederates introduced torpedo sea mine operations, and it sinks a lot of Union ships, several ironclads included, and it keeps the Confederacy in the Yazoo River for a while. But of course, the end result is that torpedoes will sink a ship, but it's not going to stop a whole fleet. Torpedoes will not stop an army and so on. So it doesn't bring about a strategic change overall. The Red River Campaign, they successfully push back the U.S. Navy, but they fail to destroy the U.S. Naval Squadron when it gets trapped near the Red River Falls at Alexandria, Louisiana. So kind of a win, kind of not really a follow-on victory. And then there's a whole bunch of raids and naval activity with cavalry, and like they capture several ships, they destroy supply depots, but they can't capitalize on that to bring any strategic implications. So the Confederacy is pretty decent at winning fights on the Mississippi River. They successfully sink numerous ships. They successfully destroy Union ironclads. They can stall pretty well, but they can't capitalize on it to bring about any real strategic results. And so the root cause of all this failure, well, number one, we looked at that organization. The flags at the bottom remind you of it. There was no clear chain of command for the Confederate Navy. They had multiple organizations answering to different people in different theaters of operations, and that was just a complete disaster. And they could have done a much better job with a clearer chain of command. Organizations competed for supplies, manpower, some of the commanders disagreed with one another, so on and so forth. Supply management was a major issue as well. And there was often times where there was pretty good cooperation between the Army and the Navy, and they would loan each other cannons and manpower and so on. But for every example of that happening, there's another example of the Confederate Army stopping a train with a bunch of gunpowder and cannons for the Navy, kicking all that stuff off the train, and then loading their own supplies on it to transport elsewhere. Or the Confederate Army just commandeering artillery for the Navy because it wants to use it here now, whereas the Navy wants to transport it 500 miles downriver to augment defenses there. So there are some cases of good cooperation, but there's also some cases of pretty poor cooperation. And then failure to capitalize on their tactical successes like we looked at on the previous slide. And then finally, we can't forget that the US Navy had a role in the Confederacy's defeat as well. Obviously, they had a major part to play with their better supply system, their military commanders showing aggressive attitude, and their ability to just overwhelm Confederate naval defenses. And so for some final conclusions, the Confederacy had a real plan to gain parity in the first year of the war, but it failed. They couldn't capitalize on it fast enough, and that caused them to lose parity. And then they started to go to more irregular operations and more local control of areas like tributary waterways. The Mississippi River Valley was a post for naval innovation, and many different innovations were started there and implemented elsewhere. And then one last chip there for the lost cause. You know, slavery was critical to these riverine efforts by the Confederacy, building ships, supplying ships, operating ships. And then one other part of the lost cause, people always talk about slavery being an impact on the war. The other part of the lost cause is that the Confederates had no chance to win the war. And, you know, on paper, the Confederates had a real strategic plan to maintain control of the Mississippi River Valley. And for a while, they stood a chance to successfully defend it, but then they were eventually overwhelmed. But that was not what the case was at the beginning of the war for certain. One last thing I want to mention is the forums. So CivilWarTalk has all the online forums. These are things that have been mentioned pretty recently, either in the naval forums or in some of the other forums as well. And I just wanted to highlight those because I'm sure that many people here read the forums and they want to know some answers to some of the things that I've talked about and all that. So one common thing on the forum is, how far out do Confederate privateers go? And it was just a general question. And I'll just say that as far as on the Mississippi River, they didn't range very far. They would go 20, 30, 40, 50 miles from the mouth of the river, capture a couple of ships, and then sneak back upriver really quickly. And then once the Union blockade of the mouth of the river started, that stopped completely. Another forum posting was about why didn't the Confederates try fleet actions to retake the Gulf of Mexico? And my answer to that is that they did try that in 1861, just nobody knows about these battles because it was, you know, a half dozen Confederate ships, a half dozen Union ships, and no famous commander like Farragut or Buchanan or Porter or anyone else like that to oversee it. And those occurred in the summer of 1861 to the spring of 1862 in the Lake Pontchartrain area, the Ship Island area, but the Mississippi Sound area, and so on. And so there was an actual campaign for control of the Gulf of Mexico, at least in coastal Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. There's a lot of questions about the ironclad Manassas that come up on the forums. How far upriver did it get at some point? Did it ever get as far up as Columbus, Kentucky? Where was it repaired? How was it repaired? And so on. So I can tell you that we have documented evidence of it moving upriver from New Orleans, moving up towards Columbus and Memphis twice. Once in December 1861 and once in about March 1862. Some claims that it made it as far as Columbus, Kentucky in December. Others say that it has documented evidence of getting as far as Memphis. But then it made it all the way back downriver and was sighted at the mouth of the Mississippi River in January 1862. Then it tried to go back upriver, got damaged when it ran aground, hit a snag in the river, and then was sent back downriver to take part in the defense of New Orleans. There was a question recently about the status of river defense fleet personnel. So civilian contractors under contract to the Confederate Army is how that group was organized. So they were not soldiers, they were civilians, and they operated separately from Confederate Army gunboats. They were their own separate organization. There's a big question about like, did they have submarines at Shreveport? What were those submarines at Shreveport, Louisiana on the Red River? So we know that something was built there. There were several small craft constructed at Shreveport, Louisiana. I personally don't think they were submarines for one reason. The Red River has a current and the submarines of the time were hand cranked, so they're not going to beat the river's current to get around. My personal belief is that they were makeshift torpedo boats, like what were used on the James River and what were used in Charleston, South Carolina. And I say that mainly because the commander of Confederate naval forces, Jonathan Carter, in Shreveport, when he writes in his letters, he references them as torpedo boats. So that's kind of my biggest thing. And when he describes them, he's describing, some of his letters describe things that could describe a submarine and some others could describe a torpedo boat. My consensus view is that it was torpedo boats built there, not submarines. There was one random question on forums of, was there ever a gunboat that used a wooden gunboat that used a spar torpedo? And the Confederate gunboat Webb on the Mississippi River, on the Red River, did use a spar torpedo once in an attack as it tried to escape the Mississippi River in April 1865. But the ship that it was attacking dodged and got out of the way. And so that strike failed, and the Webb didn't turn around to go for another attack because it was too busy trying to escape the river. Fortunately, they failed in that attack because the ship that they were targeting was an ammunition ship, and everybody would have died if that happened. And then final thing is there was a thread on the main forum of Confederate tactical innovations that might have won the war. And I just wanted to make a note on a pitch of the last chapter of my book as a pretty solid look at all of these Confederate activities, their strategies, their plans, and their tactics, and how they impacted the war overall and whether they could have done something more or been more successful. And so I'll just make a pitch of read the last chapter of my book and you'll get a pretty good idea of how that worked and why and whether they could have done more things or how it could have ended up a little bit differently perhaps. With that, I'll conclude the presentation with a little shout out of check out all these other Savas BD books that are about similar topics, like the Johnsonville book, where it's being presented next week. You guys did the Patriots Twice book a couple weeks ago. And then Lincoln Takes Command's another naval book Savas BD published this year that you guys are talking about in December. And then next month in November, they're doing an emerging Civil War book about the capture in New Orleans. And so that's pretty directly related to what we've got here. So that's my pitch for Savas BD books. And I'll conclude my presentation there and we can open it up to some Q&A and some talk from that point on.
Great. Thanks so much, Neil. That was wonderful. We are going, before we get to the question and answer, we have a lot of questions in the chat box. So if you haven't already entered your question in the chat box, go ahead and do that now. But we're going to introduce Mike Kendra, the owner of CivilWarTalk, to tell us about the forum before we get to those questions. Mike?
Yep. Thanks so much, Mr. Chatelain. That was a great presentation. I appreciate you providing a presentation tonight, and good evening to everybody. I'm Mike Kendra. I'm the owner of CivilWarTalk, and tonight CivilWarTalk's hosting Neil P. Chatelain, our guest presenter on Zoom. And this is our great opportunity to learn about another great piece of American history. If you're the author of a great Civil War book or a battlefield guide or a researcher or a collector, and you have a great story to tell, we'd love to have you speak with us about providing a presentation like the one we had tonight. If you're the author, but you're concerned that a Zoom presentation might not be, up to your speed, perhaps you'd consider a book launch at CivilWarTalk.com. We can also partner with you to execute a social media campaign to go along with CivilWarTalk Zoom presentations. Schedule your book launch today at CivilWarTalk.com. We love our weekly CivilWarTalk present programs, but there's so much more to CivilWarTalk that you won't experience in a Zoom meeting. We have our share of everyday visitors who share stories and do research, but we also have a large community of historians, reenactors, and students. I'd even say fanatics of the American Civil War. Many of us don't just read a story or two about the Civil War. We live and love to learn about the era. It's our passion. CivilWarTalk has had its origins way back in 1999, and we have over 24,000 members and over 116,000 different discussions about the war between the states. Membership in our community has always been free, and it's really easy to join too. So if you want to avoid those pesky Google advertisements on our site and also get a first shot at registering for our future Zoom meetings and other great perks, you can support Civil War Talk with a premium membership for as little as $12 a year, and you'll support our community and get lots of great perks. I want to invite you to join our community today if you haven't already. You'll find stories that you'll cherish, you'll find knowledge that'll thrill, challenge, and enlighten you, and you'll find friends that'll last a lifetime. Join Civil War Talk tonight. We hope to see you all in our community soon. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Mike. Mr. Chatelain, if you're ready to get to those questions, we'll do that now. If our guests haven't already entered their questions, go ahead and enter your questions in the chat box, and we'll address those in the order that they appear in the chat box. So you guys go ahead and get those entered. And Neil, if you're ready, let's see. The first question wants to know if the Confederacy, does the Confederacy ever build a purpose-built wooden warship from scratch that's not an ironclad?
So they absolutely do, and they do in the Mississippi River Valley, in fact. The example I'll use, because this isn't the only example, but it's the one I'll use because it's tied to my book, is on Lake Pontchartrain, north of the city of New Orleans. There was a shipyard owned by a famous New Orleans shipyard owner named John Hughes. And in his shipyard, in the fall of 1861, the Confederacy built 2 purpose-built wooden warships, and then they started construction of 1 ironclad there. And those 2 purpose-built wooden warships were specifically designed for those coastal operations, those campaigns in the first year of the war to maintain control of the Gulf of Mexico and the coastal parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. So they were small wooden warships, but they were purpose-built for the Confederate Navy. So yeah, the answer is they did. So for sure.
Great, thanks. Let's see. Tina would like to know if you would go over what you said about the river defense leader, Montgomery, I think was his name, and he wasn't going to cooperate with the Confederate Navy. So what she wants to know is, she can't remember the other guy's name, but she said, what was the point of making that claim, or not being non-cooperative, I guess?
So the Montgomery actually cooperated with the Confederate Navy pretty well. His subordinate, John Stevenson, did not, but Montgomery operated his ships upriver by Memphis area. Stevenson was the guy in charge of the river defense fleet ships at New Orleans. And the reason Stevenson didn't want to cooperate with the Confederate Navy is because Stevenson had actually tried to convince the Confederate Navy to build ironclads out of tugboats. And the Confederate Navy ignored his request, and he said, fine, I'll just do it myself. And he was the guy who actually constructed and converted a tug into what became the Confederate ironclad Manassas, the first ironclad in North America. And he built it, he raised the funds himself. He was going to use it as a privateer to sink Union warships, prove the theory of his design, and then convince the Confederate Navy to build a whole bunch more. And then the Confederate Navy, after it was built, seized the ship and paid him some money for it like 6 months later. And so he had a grudge, he had an axe to grind for real. They ignored his plan. And then when he started to prove his design, they took his ship anyway from him. And so obviously he has a grudge. So it's kind of no wonder why he would refuse to cooperate with the same naval officers that stole his ship from him. So it's not surprising, but it had some pretty disastrous results with that whole chain of command issue.
Yeah, it seems like some of those things that went on were, they weren't thinking like what would be the results of these decisions or these actions, you know?
Well, they asked him nicely to cooperate, and when he said no, then they seized the ship. So there was some cooperation requests, but like it was a disaster on all parts with that.
Wow. Okay, let's see. The next question, Karen wants to know if the drawings and graphs that you showed in the presentation, are those in the book, or is that something that you just shared with us?
So the vast majority of them are in the book. The notes about the enslaved persons are not, because I didn't want to use one of the few spots for pictures on a piece of paper. But most of the ships and most of the images of the sketches of diagrams, those are all in there. And then all the maps that I used in this presentation are maps from the book itself.
How many maps in the book? How many total maps?
7 or 8, something along those lines.
Okay, let's see. Here's another question. Weren't the chains of command and the jealousy of different commanders, land and sea, one of the bugbears? I guess that means one of the challenges of the Confederacy overall.
So in fact, yes, the Confederate Navy and Army would often disagree over who had overall charge of everything. And it wasn't until after New Orleans fell and some other things like that, where the Confederate government actually passed legislation that clarified things, where the Confederate Army would take and supersede command over Confederate naval forces if commanders had equal rank. And so, like, when we get to the defenses of Charleston, South Carolina later in the war, where everyone says, oh, Beauregard did such a great job defending Charleston, that's because the Confederate Navy was liable by law to support his plans. And so, greater cooperation was required there. And so that's kind of why things cleared up later in the war, but not so much in the early part of the war, because it was still very muddy waters as to who oversaw who and who superseded which group.
Interesting. That's interesting that it took them that long to decide that or to figure it out. Jennifer said she finds the innovations by the Confederacy to be some of the most interesting parts of the book. I think she must have already read the book. So, okay. Next question. Alan would like to know, what exactly was Cairo's mission when it was sunk, and what was it doing in the Yazoo River?
So it was actually not alone. It was part of a group of ships, and they were scouting up the Yazoo River to A, find Confederate defenses, and then B, try and draw them out. Because remember, this is December 1862. It's right around the time Sherman's moving around with the whole Chickasaw Bluffs campaign time period. And so this Cairo sinking is kind of tied to that to an extent, in that Porter's ironclads and ships, or the Union naval forces there, are trying to support those land operations. And part of that is just clearing out Confederates from the Yazoo River, because the Chickasaw Bluffs operation was very near the Yazoo River. They just want, it was kind of a securing the flank kind of a situation.
I see. Okay. This is my own question. What's the difference between a mine and a torpedo?
So torpedo was the term used at the time for mines, both land mines and sea mines. Later on, we would change the name in the 1870s when the U.S. Navy started to use propelled torpedoes to a greater extent, and then the terminology shifted. That's all. So they refer to them as torpedoes almost exclusively. I use the term sea mine tonight just because that's what people will recognize as a sea mine.
Okay, thanks. Let's see, wonderful, somebody said wonderful presentation, and I agree it was. Let's see, Nate would like to know, he said Marine junkie here. I know the CS Marines involved at Ship Island, Mobile Bay, and the companies formed in New Orleans. Any idea how many Marines serve further up in the Mississippi and its tributaries?
So there was a Confederate Marine Corps recruiting station in Memphis, Tennessee, and then they transported Marines further to Richmond, Virginia after they were recruited there. And then several of the Confederate naval ships operating upriver at parts of the war did have Marines on board as part of their ship's complement. The largest group of that would be the Marine detachment on the Confederate warship McRae, which had about 15 to 20 Marines on board at any given time. So there were some, but it was more sporadic for sure.
Okay, and Michael would like to know, what was the name of the ironclad built on Lake Pontchartrain?
It didn't have a name. We only have records of sales records for Lake Pontchartrain ironclad. So they didn't get far enough in the construction to even figure out a name for it before New Orleans fell. And it was just everything that they had started to build was just torched before it could fall into Union hands.
Too bad it didn't get a name, isn't it? The next question is very long. Let's see. We may have to put this one in the forum. I can't seem to find the exact question. The expense invested in cannons and use huge pile of dirt, whole armies of men only fixed them in place where they could be surrounded and forced to surrender. The ironclad gunboats were expensive, isolated, and only succeeded in annoying the Union flotilla. You have a comment on that?
I'm trying to read the question itself here. Are you talking about the one by from Rhea? Is that right? Is that the one you're looking at? So I have not seen the codes specifically used. I have seen some codes that were put in place by the Army and the Navy in some instances. So for instance, when the Confederate Navy was preparing for that fight at New Orleans, they actually wrote out a bunch of signal codes on one piece of paper that theoretically made it to all the ships, but obviously they weren't used because nobody was paying attention to any of the chain of command. But there is a copy of that at the LSU library. So they did have codes, and I've seen some of them, but it's very sporadic. The Confederate Navy had a signal book of signal flags and such that was basically copied from the United States Navy. So I know that they had specific codes for certain things. However, I couldn't find specifics as to what he mentions with Baton Rouge on like what specific signal book they were using for that. I'm assuming it was a pretty rudimentary signal system of just like shoot left, shoot right, shoot up, shoot down, you know, advance or extend, and then come short, that kind of stuff. Let me just make sure I didn't get missing anything else on it. Torpedo saying the most informal. Defend against. So the horse artillery and riverine assets. So I think that the Confederates never planned on such a mobile force. However, in several places, that's the kind of naval force that developed. We're talking about mobile Confederate Army forces leading horse artillery and field artillery that can move very quickly to then disable Union warships and then seize them. It was not an officially designed method that the Confederate military adopted, but I will tell you that there are instances of that specific case happening on the White River, on the Yazoo River, on the Tennessee River, on Bayou Teche, and on the Red River, I believe, as well. But so there were multiple instances of the Confederate Army, the Confederate cavalry, utilizing mobility to try and outflank and basically continually harass Union warships or supply ships to make sure that they were overpowered eventually and then captured or sunk. So there's a few instances of that. I don't think that there's any evidence of it being a directed, planned, strategic method, but improvisation worked pretty well in a few instances. But of course, that didn't bring strategic gains. That just brought some tactical local victories. So great long question. Sorry, everybody. I wanted to make sure I had that one right. So
thanks. We're running out of time. So that was a long question. And there was another part to it that was that we'll post the entire question in the forum. In fact, we'll just post the chat log from the forum. I mean, from this program into the chat log at CivilWarTalk.com. And you can address any questions that we might have missed. We'll let you answer those there if you don't mind.
I'm happy and at your disposal to answer any follow-on questions if we have to. That's easy.
Great. Well, we sure appreciate you being here with us. And we want to remind everyone that all of our guests provide these presentations with no compensation. So we encourage everyone to order their own copy of Mr. Chatelain's book, Defending the Arteries of the Rebellion, Confederate Naval Operations in the Mississippi River Valley, 1861 to 1865. It was just released last month from Savas Beatty, and our friends at Savas Beatty want to thank folks for adapting to the current new normal and for participating tonight in this event. When ordering Mr. Chatelain's book through the Savas Beatty website, you can add the code at checkout to receive 20% discount off your total purchase, and you can add Mr. Chatelain's book to your cart, and then you can add all those other books he recommended to your cart. And when you enter the code that Tina's entering in the chat box now, you'll be able to receive 20% off of the entire purchase. Here's Neil's 2014 book, Fought Like Devils, The Confederate Gunboat McRae, and it is available at Amazon.com. The McRae, as Neil alluded to, was originally intended to roam the seas as one of the first commerce raiders with a secret mission to to travel to England and gather much needed supplies for the new Confederacy, but instead circumstances kept her on the Mississippi, where she fought from the river's mouth to the banks of Kentucky. Most notably, the McRae participated in the defenses of New Orleans in April of 1862. It really sounds like a fascinating book, and you can purchase it for yourself at Amazon.com. Coming up, we have presenters scheduled through the end of the year, and we wanted to let you know who those would be. Like Neil said, on October 28th, which is next Wednesday, that will be Jerry Wooten, and his program will be on his latest book, Johnsonville Union Supply Operations on the Tennessee River and the Battle of Johnsonville, November 4th through the 5th. So it'll almost be on the anniversary of that event. November 4th, we have Scott Mingus on the Cumberland Valley Railroad in the Civil War. On November 11th, Ron Kirkwood on the George Spangler Farm in the Battle of Gettysburg. November 18th, Ken Rutherford on landmines in the Civil War. And we have, like I said, we have programs scheduled all the way through the end of the year. Steve Norder, that Neil mentioned, will be with us on December 2nd and December 9th. Christopher Loperfido with the Civil War Letters of Surgeon James Benton. Bradley Gottfried will be here on December 16th with the maps of the cavalry in the Gettysburg campaign. December 30th, John Corstein will be back with us. He was here a few weeks ago and spoke about the, on this date, on December 30th, he'll be talking about the sinking of the Uss Monitor. And it's on the anniversary of the date that it sailed for its last, it was sunk the next day, I think. Is that right, Neil? Something like that. It sailed out that morning and was sunk later that night, or?
Yeah, it sunk in a storm while being towed further down the coastline to go take part in the operations near Charleston, South Carolina.
Yeah, so that'll be almost, I mean, that'll be on the anniversary of when it sailed out before it sank. And then, as promised last week, we had Lance Hurtigan here, and he was fantastic, and he will be back with us on a date to be announced in January. So our next Civil War Talk Presents will be next Wednesday at 8:30, and we'll feature Jerry Wooten on his new book, Johnsonville Union Supply Operations on the Tennessee River and the Battle of Johnsonville, November 4th and 5th, 1864. I hope you'll all join us then. Thanks so much for tuning in tonight. See you next week on Wednesday at 8:30.